Great.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I'm Melanie Colavito. I'm going to kick off our presentation today, and I want to acknowledge, of course, that Kat and Nikki will also be speaking, so we're going to be trading back and forth a little bit. Thank you to the Southwest Fire Science Consortium and to the participants here today for joining our talk. We're very excited to share these findings with you and look forward to your feedback as well. So without further ado, we will start talking about public experiences with wildfire and flooding from a case study of the museum fire near Flagstaff, Arizona. So Flagstaff, Arizona is in Coconino County, and it's a pretty good place to understand public experiences with wildfire and post-wildfire flooding. So I'm just going to give you a really short history of some key events that have shaped the greater Flagstaff area. Starting with 2010, there was a fire called the Schultz Fire that burned some steep slopes outside of a community just north of Flagstaff that led to some significant post-fire flooding. That then galvanized community interest and perceptions around the need for addressing this post-fire flooding issue, and eventually led to a taxpayer-funded bond that funded something called the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, or FWIP for short, that sought to treat the density of fuels on steep slopes that were adjacent to the community watersheds and could pose a critical risk to infrastructure within the city of Flagstaff, both in terms of built infrastructure and watershed infrastructure. So the 2010 Schultz Fire galvanized an effort to treat this area and deal with steep slopes to reduce the risk of catastrophic flooding after fires. In addition to these two events, there were also multiple studies that took place in the Flagstaff area that shaped some of the community as well. So one was a full cost accounting that was done following the Schultz Fire in 2013 that was later updated in 2020. There was also a cost avoidance study that was done to look at what would the costs avoided be if we were to treat those steep slopes around the city watershed. There were also studies done for the entire county on post-fire flooding assessments, like what would be the possibility for extreme catastrophic flooding throughout the county. And then also there were a number of other assessments done to really kind of understand the context, understand perceptions, and inform decision-making and action. So after the bond measure was funded for the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, that began, and I'm not going to give you a history of that particular project for today's purposes, but just suffice it to say that implementation of this project was underway in multiple phases in the year 2019 when the museum fire occurred. Those phases included thinning steep slopes, as I mentioned, that included helicopter logging and all kinds of other hand thinning and various operations. So in July 2019, the museum fire started on some of those steep slopes in an area that was undergoing treatment as part of the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project. The cause of that fire was due to equipment that was out in the woods working on FWIP. And so it was really kind of an unfortunate circumstance in terms of the thinning equipment that was being used to do this work to protect the watershed also subsequently led to the start of the fire, although there was no negligence determined as a result of the investigation following that. However, that start led to what was eventually about a 2,000 acre, just under 2,000 acre fire, the museum fire that burned through an area called the Dry Lake Hills. This area has a lot of steep slopes. There was a lot of fuel on the ground due to going on as a part of the Flagstaff protection. There are log decks that were awaiting sale and removal that were burned up as a result of the fire. So you can see some of the images inside. There's before and after photos of the amount of fuel that had been removed from the fire. And then the result of that after it had been burned, and also an image of one of those logs burning during the museum fire. So following this event, there was immediate attention, especially with what had happened from the Schultz fire, to the potential for post-fire flooding. And July is typically the monsoon season in northern Arizona. 2019 turned out to be one of the lowest monsoon seasons on record. It was shortly followed by 2020, the lowest monsoon season on record. So what should have been our rainy wasn't. However, immediate concern turned to the potential for post-fire flooding in a different part of town than the Schultz fire had following the museum fire. So sandbags were put in place. The community really came together to protect our infrastructure following that event. But it didn't really rain. It didn't really rain until 2021. So in the summer of 2021, the monsoons returned with their usual spotty and intense behavior. There were 5 rain events, significant monsoon rain events over the burn scar from the museum fire that led to flooding downstream from that burn scar. There were also monsoon events that occurred just adjacent to the area that was downstream from the burn scar, but was not within the area that was impacted by the burn scar. So many of you have probably seen a video of a Prius floating down a street in Flagstaff. And that was widely circulated on the internet and talked about as an impact of post-wildfire flooding. Well, that street was not impacted by the flooding from the museum fire. However, it is in the same neighborhood, but it's over the hill from where the flooding was coming down from the burn scar. So these are adjacent disturbance events, possibly from the same storm, but impacting areas downstream of an area that hadn't been burned, as well as an area that had been burned. So we have 2 events kind of compounding each other in the same area of Flagstaff. That is all to say that this created a lot of miscommunication. There were, there was a lot of confusion following these different compounding rain events. There was also a significant impact to a road, that goes up Mount Eldon, where there's infrastructure for cell phone towers and trails and things like that. So the post-fire flooding really came in full force in summer of 2021. And then also, there was this additional flooding that occurred. So that is all to say that, and I forgot to mention 2 other things, that in 2019, immediately following the fire, we conducted one survey of the public to understand experiences with the fire at that time. And Kat's going to talk a little bit more about that. And so then in 2021, following that first summer of flooding that impacted the museum fire burn scar, we wanted to better understand what had changed for the community of Flagstaff. Given that we had done this survey in 2019, we had the opportunity to understand over the duration of that 2-year period, what had changed, what were resident experiences like. And so the objective of our current presentation, our current study, is to explore how these cascading disturbances of wildfire and post-wildfire flooding combined with adjacent disturbances like an extreme rain event really impact the community and how residents were informed of, perceive, and respond to these type of events. And so before I pass it to Kat, I do just want to note quickly that in the spring of 2022, another fire burned through the area that was impacted by the 2010 fire, the Schultz fire. This was called the Tunnel Fire and burned a number of homes down. And then in the summer of 2022, there was another fire on the San Francisco Peaks called the fire that also led to significant post-fire flooding. Our survey had already been developed, our survey that you're going to hear about, when the events occurred. And so it does not capture the impact of those events, but Kat can a little bit more about the nuances of that. So I will pass it over to you now, Kat.
Thanks very much. And hopefully you're seeing from that introduction, Flagstaff is a pretty unique place in how far along it is with post-fire flood experiences. We had the Schultz, now we have the museum fire. We're quite well positioned to really have a deeper understanding ahead of all the other places in the West that are probably going to start seeing impacts like this in the future. So building off what Melanie said, there's a lot of social complexities around this. And around 2019, when the museum fire happened, we were talking a lot about what would be the best way to understand the public. There was a lot of interest from managers in the area to have some numbers or some insights to go off of. So we settled on this survey. And if we go to the next slide, So we had that set of two surveys that Melanie mentioned. The first one was in 2019, and that was quite an opportunistic. We knew there was a lot of information or interest in information from residents affected in that area. So we decided to take a mixed mode approach, and that means just administering the same survey using different platforms. So the first platform was a mail survey. We were sending out physical copies of the survey to, I think, 2,700 homes, and we'll take a look at the sample frame in a minute. We also offered it online through this platform called Qualtrics, and the City of Flagstaff actually uploaded a version on their public engagement platform as well. So we were able to gather a few more people there. We sent one reminder postcard for that effort, and we ended up with a 22.3% response rate, which is pretty in line for what we've been seeing in Flagstaff. We've done a few other surveys in the area, and somewhere between 20 and 22% is pretty common at the moment. Then in 2022, we had this opportunity, kind of unusual, to be able to go back and resurvey some of these places and get a sense of longitudinally what have the experiences been with this risk. This took a similar shape, mixed mode again. We did the mail survey packet with a physical copy, but responses were a little harder to come by. So we did do 2 reminder postcards as well as the online version. And this led us to a 16% response rate, which is a little bit lower than perhaps we'd like. But Melanie mentioned we had the pipeline fire that began probably a week after we mailed these out. So I think folks were a little bit distracted. So something we couldn't have foreseen. But all of this data does align well with the census data for the area. So we know that we've got small but mighty data. It is representative of the area. Next slide. So here's the sample frame for our first survey in 2019. And our goal with this was really to gather different experiences with the same event and see how that influenced support, experiences, risk perceptions, things like that. So that blue stripe down the middle, that was the flood risk area generated by the museum fire burn scar. Then we've got this red crosshatch area. You can see an area close to town, and then this longer piece that goes up north of town. Those were all the areas under Ready, Set, Go, different components of that system during the fire. And then we also took a random sample of properties within the city limits and surrounding area to kind of act as a control group. We won't talk very much about the differences between these 3 groups in this webinar, but we do have a publication on that. And I think we have a link to that at the end that we'll share. Next slide. The 2022 survey was a little bit different because we were really interested in that post-fire flooding or that flooding experience explicitly, now that some flood events actually had happened in the area. And Melanie mentioned, so there were kind of 2 catalysts when that storm came through. It could either be generated from the burn scar or just really intense rainfall in the area. The flood kind of came down through these 2 channels divided by topography and kind of merged in this neighborhood in the blue stripe here and to the left of that. So we use this term flooding just generally. We didn't call it post-fire flooding. We didn't call it rainfall-driven flooding. We wanted it to be vague intentionally so that people would interpret that to the risk they thought they had, particularly because a lot of the managers we were talking with at the time really wanted to know if people had an idea of where their risk was coming from. So you'll see us use the term just flooding, and that's the reason behind that there. Next slide. Oh, and I should have mentioned the area that was surveyed in our second survey is that black outline that you're seeing here in both of these images. So that was a slightly different sample frame area, and we had about just under 4,000 addresses in that, so a little bit larger as well, but much more flooding focused. So here are the flood models that we use side by side. These are generated by J.E. Fuller, a consulting company in town who work with the county a lot. That one on the left-hand side for 2019, this was generated really rapidly around the time that the fire was happening. We needed to know where the flood risk was going to be. We had those experiences with the Schultz fire, so we knew this was a risk. So this is kind of perhaps low resolution, really rapidly generated to a 3-inch flood depth, which they thought was most likely. event at the time, and this was what was shared at all the public meetings. On the right-hand side, we have an updated version, and this was actually being generated at the same time we ran that second survey in 2022, unbeknownst to us. So now we have this, and you can see that there's much more granularity in the second generation. And this is actually to a 2-inch flood depth, which is now what they think is likely to be the most probable flood event. So it gets much more very localized topography, like street curbs on the side of roads and things like that. So although the folks in this area hadn't yet seen this model at the time, this piece was kind of integrating all those mitigation efforts to become more accurate. Next slide. So to tie that all together in this methods piece, here's who responded from where. 14% of our survey respondents in 2022 were in that 2019 blue striped modeled area. But then that goes up much higher in our second survey, and that makes sense because we changed our sample frame a little bit to capture that flood risk area better. Almost 60% were in the 2022 modeled flood risk area. About 13% were in both of those areas. So that shows you how much change there's been between those two models and where the flood risk is in the area. And just over 40% were not in any modeled flood risk area at all. Next slide. So we're going to dive into the findings here, and we've grouped it up by kind of themes in our data. This first one is communication. What information were people getting? Where were they getting it from? That kind of thing. So next slide. In the 2019 survey, most of our respondents, so 60% almost, were using social media to find their emergency information. And I think that speaks a lot to the thirst for information that the residents in Flagstaff have. We did some interviews to follow up this survey afterwards, and if people didn't have an update or new information within every hour or two on InciWeb, which we know doesn't really happen, they were going out looking for it on social media. So there was a lot of gravitation towards that in these gaps between official notifications. Most of our survey respondents at this time were signed up for Coconino County emergency alerts, but they didn't quite connect that to what information they were getting. So a lot of people knew that they were signed up, they were getting ready, set, go messages, but they didn't realize that they were getting those ready, set, go messages because they'd signed up. So there was a little bit of a disconnect there. Although, so having said that, 3/4 of our respondents felt that communication about the museum fire and post-fire flood risk was clear. So we've got a win there. Next slide. We were also interested in what format people were getting their information from, and we're just going to dive into the meetings that were held here. So this slide is who came in person to these public meetings. And this is just under 1/3 of our data set in the 2019 survey. On the left-hand side here, meetings about the museum fire. Most of the time, people in person were from those evacuation zones, which makes sense. We did have quite a number of folks from that from the flood risk area, and then a couple from the city limits. On the right-hand side, we have post-fire flood risk meetings. So they started to transition from fire to flooding in these public communications within the weeks that followed. This still had a lot of interest from evacuation, and you can see the city limits folks are there. I think there was a lot of interest in clarifying whether properties were or weren't in the flood zone at that time, which could maybe explain that those are quite overrepresented there. If we go to the next slide. This next one is who came virtually. So this is useful to remember in the context of this was 2019 before COVID and Zoom took over. And we had far more participation in meetings virtually even then. So that trend in interest on Facebook live streams, Zoom meetings for fire and flood information was happening even before March 2020. On the right-hand side, again, we've got meetings about the museum fire. A lot more flood risk folks attended this. So I think a clarification of whether that fire was coming towards them at the time and starting to suspect perhaps that they might be looking for flood information down the road. On the right-hand side there, we've got the post-fire flood risk information. And again, the flood risk group didn't really attend these. What we do know is there were a lot of door-to-door communications after these public meetings or during them at the same time where they were setting up MOUs around sandbags. So one explanation for this might be that a lot of them were already getting information face-to-face. But you can see again there the city limits folks are very present, trying to figure out if this is something they need to be concerned about. Next slide. In the 2022 survey, we asked them where they were receiving information from, and these are a few cherry-picked ones. More than half were getting things from that emergency alert system that we mentioned earlier. But more than half were also noticing for the first time that it was flooding by just looking outside and seeing it happen. Some of the less common responses, keeping an eye on the weather forecast, and less than 1% had an official come to their property. We know in the fire literature, people expect an in-person evacuation notification a lot of the time. If that is the case with post-fire flooding down the road, now we have some numbers to indicate that's really not a feasible expectation there either. Next slide. The last piece I'll share about communication is trust and information sources. Over time, in both of these surveys, we asked about trustworthiness of a few different information sources. And you can see in that middle column, in 2019, we asked about trustworthiness of information about the museum fire specifically. In 2022, we asked about flood risk specifically. So pretty high trustworthiness in all of these sources in 2019. When we got to 2020, you see some decreases in the Forest Service, law enforcement, and the fire department. Those were also sources people weren't going to as much in 2022 because they're not commonly thought of as sources of information for flooding. But Coconino County and the city of Flagstaff were putting out a lot of information. And you can see they both had a slight decrease in trustworthiness there. So I think perhaps there is a little bit of confusion about what is trustworthy data in post-fire environments. Okay, I'll hand it over to Nikki for the next section.
Hi, thank you. So I'll be going over our next 3 sections of results. First, we're going to talk about perceptions of post-fire flood risk. Next slide. Great. So on our survey, both in 2019 and in 2022, we asked folks to report the likelihood of a flood event damaging a neighborhood in Flagstaff in the next 10 years. In 2019, just over 65% of folks thought that it was likely to, 65% was the average likelihood that a flood event would damage a neighborhood in Flagstaff in the next 10 years. And then in 2022, this number jumped up to over 90% reported likelihood of a flood damaging a neighborhood in Flagstaff. So there's a marked increase here with folks actually thinking that flooding is much more likely to happen in the coming years. Next slide. And in 2022, we asked folks about how long they anticipated flood risk to last in their area. It's kind of left general in the question. 29% of folks really thought that flood risk will last either more than 100 years or that flood risk is permanent. On the other end of the spectrum, about 26% of folks thought flood risk would only last 1 to 5 years. So there's a real spectrum in answers here. What is interesting to note is that only 6% of respondents thought that there was absolutely no flood risk in their area. And the majority thought that flood risk was likely to stick around from a few years to many, many years. Next slide. And then we also asked in the 2022 survey, how would respondents characterize flood risk to their property? And then we compared responses based on where their property was located using some of our spatial data. It's clear here that those living in the areas without modeled flood risk in both 2019 and in 2022, that top row there in the graph, think that they have less flood risk than others. Only a little, around 15% think they have higher extreme flood risk to their property. But at the same time, it's interesting to note that 86% of those folks overall think they have some level of flood risk to their property. So they might be overestimating a bit the flood risk or not fully understanding exactly where the flood risk is coming from. What is also interesting to note is that those who are located in the 2019 modeled flood risk area, that last row on the graph here, over 60% of those folks think that they have high or extreme flood risk to their property in the coming years. And so that indicates that those living in that 2019 flood risk are very aware of their risk. Now in the 2022 flood risk modeled area, that kind of third row there, what's interesting to note is that only 26% of those folks think they have high or extreme flood risk. And that's a much lower percentage than those living in the 2019 modeled flood risk area. So that's something to think about, because they don't think they have as much extreme or high flood risk. And as we said earlier, that 2022 modeled area came out, that new map came out after our survey was completed. And so folks aren't actually responding to that model and understanding risk in their area when they're taking the survey. But it's really important to note that perhaps we should be doing a lot of work to publicize this model, because if folks are really basing their insurance purchases, for example, on the 2019 modeled flood risk, then they might not be continuing their insurance when they should be based on the 2022 modeled flood risk. And we do know that this new modeled flood risk map has been publicized. It's just not fully captured in the survey here. Next slide. We also asked folks about what they perceived to be influences of various environmental factors on flooding in the 2022 survey. So the most commonly cited influence on flooding in Flagstaff is the museum fire burn scar, with 92% of respondents believing that this was very or extremely influential on flooding, that second to last row from the bottom. The next most commonly cited cause, with 83% of respondents thinking that it was a very or extremely influential cause, is monsoonal rain events. And so, as Melanie mentioned earlier, the survey area was affected by both museum fire burn scar events, but also monsoonal rain events. And people are really picking up on those two influences on flooding in the responses to the survey. Around 68% of folks think that blockages or overflow or infrastructure are very or extremely influential rain events. That's kind of our next highest response there. And then 61% think that climate change is very or extremely influential on flood events. The last two components here are recent forest management efforts and burn scars from other fires besides the museum fire. And less than 40% of respondents think that both of these are very, very or extremely influential on flood events. So not as much of a focus as the cause for flood events, according to our survey group. Next slide. And so our next batch of results really talks about experiences with flooding in 2021, what folks actually experienced during the floods and what kind of actions they took to mitigate. Next slide. So in the 2022 survey, we asked about experiences in the previous years in the 2021 flooding in Flagstaff. And 16%, we also asked about if they had experienced flooding on their property before 2021, and 16% of respondents said that yes, they had. Now, this is actually interesting, because in the flood, when we asked them specifically about flood experiences in 2021, 28% said that they experienced flood either inside their home or on their property in 2021, which is a big change from the 16% that said they had experienced flooding on their property before 21. I'll note that we didn't ask before 21, we didn't ask to them to break it down inside their home versus on their property. So I'm kind of lumping those two together in the comparison. What's also interesting to note here is that about a quarter of people said that there was no flooding in their area, which means that 75% of respondents, the vast majority here, either experienced flooding in their home, on their property, on their street, or on their neighborhood. It was a fairly widespread within this survey sample area, which makes sense since that's how we targeted the survey sample. Also, nearly 87% of folks thought that the flooding was somewhat to far more severe than expected. So the 2021 flooding caught a lot of people off guard. Next slide. We also asked specifically about damage and impacts. Impacts to both physical property and also how lives were being lived in those seasons. And so 30% reported that property damage was caused, they had property damage caused by the 2021 floods. Of these, around 84% reported that they had non-structural damage. That's things like driveways, landscaping, fencing. And of those that had the property damage, about 22% reported damage to the interior of their home. Other impacts were about nearly a third of respondents had to rearrange their work schedule or rearrange their schedule due to flooding events. And 11% said that they actually couldn't get to work at some point due to flooding. Next slide. We also asked specifically in the 2022 survey about mental and physical health impacts. The most common impact here, the second from the bottom, was worry about other safety, with 77% of respondents saying that they worried about the safety of their family and their friends and their neighbors because of flood risk. 55% said they often worried about the impacts of future floods, that middle line there. 48% said they felt anxious or worried due to flood risk, and 46% said they worried about the safety of their property due to flood risk. What's good to see here is that kind of the most acute and severe health impacts, fewer folks agree that they were experiencing these impacts. So just 22% said they had experienced significant stress because of flood risk. 14% said their mental health suffered because of flood risk, that top line, and then 9% said their physical health suffered because of flood risk. This really indicates that in our sample, people were most stressed kind of by worry of for themselves, for their property, for their friends and neighbors, rather than experiencing most directly the very acute and stressful health impacts. Although it's clear that the ones who are experiencing these impacts, their experiences shouldn't be minimized either. Next slide. We also asked what actions folks took to actually mitigate flood impacts on their private property. In 2019 survey, 13% of respondents said that they used sandbags, and then this use of sandbags more than doubled, with 27% of respondents in 2022 saying that they use sandbags on their property. Other common actions taken were that nearly 37% cleared flood debris from drainage areas, roads, and sidewalks. 24% said they parked vehicles off the street in order to get them out of flood zones. And only 16% said they built an emergency stay kit. When we have talked about some of these results with some of our city and county partners, and some of them had expressed kind of disappointment that this wasn't a higher number, as this is often kind of in the messaging about how to deal with floods. So not a whole lot of people actually built those preparedness kits. And then 67% of folks said they didn't take any of these actions because they felt that their property's flood risk was really too low to warrant mitigation efforts, thinking that it wasn't super necessary for their household. Next slide. And then we have a block of questions here about future forest management efforts. We really wanted to understand what the Flagstaff community thought about forest management and its connection to flood risk. Next slide. In the 2019 survey, we asked if residents were aware of the reported cause of the museum fire, and the vast majority, 85%, said that they were aware. As Melanie mentioned earlier, the cause of this fire was determined to be from a spark from equipment being used on a forest thinning operation, despite the operator completing a 1-hour fire watch before leaving the site. There was no negligence in the cause of the fire, but it was very much tied to forest thinning operations. And then over 86% of respondents agreed that fire is actually a natural part of the landscape around Flagstaff, expecting fire to be there. 74% agreed that the landscape would recover from the impacts of the museum fire. So kind of positive outlook overall that things, that fire should be on the landscape and is part of the landscape, and the landscape can recover from this. Next slide. We asked how residents saw forest management and the impacts of forest management in the 2022 survey. So overall, most residents really see it positively. Over 70% of respondents thought that continued forest management would lead to all of these different benefits listed here. But as you can see, everyone agreed in over 70% for all of these responses. So forest management will improve watershed health, forest health. They thought it would help minimize costs of post-fire flooding and future wildfires, that it would protect, forest management would protect city water resources and also reduce the risk of post-fire flooding and catastrophic wildfire. So folks are really seeing a connection here folks from the Flagstaff area are really seeing a connection here between forest management and various benefits to both forest, fire, and watershed health. Next slide. And then we asked specifically about different types of forest management and to see what public support is for these different types. Around 90% of folks said that they were very supportive of, that they found fuel breaks and the strategic removal of trees to be very acceptable forest management practices. They also, around 80% of folks said that they also approved of the use of prescribed fire on the landscape. And 74% said that they were okay with quote unquote managed fire or letting lightning ignited fires be allowed to burn on the landscape. I think this is also interesting as the survey went out, was being taken while some of these fires were going on that Melanie mentioned earlier, that in the 2021 fire season, we had both the pipeline and the tunnel fires that led to evacuations and homes burning down. And so it was an active fire season, very much affecting the Flagstaff area. Some people turned in their survey before many of the acute fire impacts were really seen. A few folks might have turned in some of these surveys a little bit towards the end of that fire season, but folks were living with fire on the landscape and still actually indicated a fairly high level of support for getting more fire on the landscape, either through lightning ignited fires burn or through prescribed fire. Next slide. And then our last slide here is just focusing, we asked folks about partnerships for forest management. Around 90% of respondents agreed in both years, both surveys, that partnerships between the city, the Forest Service, and other organizations are the best way to address fire risk in Flagstaff. And 73% of folks really supported future initiatives like the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Partnership, or FWIP, that Melanie mentioned earlier, which was a partnership among the city, the Coconino National Forest, and in the county to reduce wildfire and flood risk in Flagstaff. And so folks were actually still interested in supporting more of these types of initiatives. As she mentioned earlier, that in 2012, there's a $10 million bond passed to support these efforts and to fund them and to continue having them occur in order to mitigate wildfire and flood risk. Okay, next slide, and I'll pass it over to Melanie.
Great, thanks, Nikki. It sounds like my video or my sound was cutting out a little bit, so I'm going to keep my video off and turn now to some of our takeaway messages. All right, so we have a couple categories of discussion or takeaway messages. The first focuses on post-fire flooding experiences. So some of the lessons learned from the 2022 survey, which as Nikki and Kat described, really did focus specifically on flooding. But in comparison with our 2019 survey, we are learning that people do look to different information sources depending on the type of hazard. So in essence, there are different types of information seeking behaviors that we're seeing from respondents depending on the circumstances that they are experiencing. The other thing that I think is very notable is that we did see that decrease in trustworthiness of our information sources from the survey that focused on fire to the survey that focused on flooding. And as was mentioned previously, that is partly due to the fact that some of those information sources that we included in the 2022 survey are not usually the ones that are actively putting out information about flooding. However, there was that sort of decrease that we did observe over time. I think we also noted from the survey findings focused specifically on flooding was that the majority of respondents were thinking that the burn scar and monsoon rain events were largely to blame for flooding. So there's a high degree of understanding of the source of this, where this water is coming from. And there was also the finding that the flooding was more severe than expected. So it did seem to take people by surprise. And some of the biggest impacts were that people were, affected in terms of going to work, or they were worried. And then some smaller number of people that were really impacted physically and mentally by those events. In terms of the communication, though, one thing that I think we are learning is that post-fire flood communication is potentially not at the same level of maturity as far as in comparison to during fire communication. So We, in the 2019 survey, and we didn't include these results just due to lack of time today, we looked at the Ready, Set, Go program and how that works, and found that there, you know, a couple lessons learned around that, but that communication during fire is pretty, it's a pretty well-oiled machine. The communication about flooding is much more confusing and a little bit less mature than the during fire communication. This may indicate that there is a need to test different messaging options with different groups, people who are impacted by the fire versus the flooding. And a lot of times these are events that are occurring quickly. And so generating that type of information is challenging in a short time turnaround. But I think that there are a lot of lessons that we can learn from last year's tunnel and pipeline fire events in the Flagstaff area, which did result in a quick turnaround in terms of analysis, but wasn't the object of the study here today. And so another major take-home message in terms of looking at our respondents and where they were geographically was that many of our respondents who do have modeled flood risk, who do not have modeled flood risk, think that they are at risk. So people who are not at risk think they are at risk. And those who do have modeled flood risk in 2022, according to the new modeling that was done, believe they are not at risk. So there really is some messaging opportunities here to make sure that those people that are at risk are aware of that, and that they're renewing their insurance or purchasing flood insurance and taking other effective actions, and that those who are not at risk aren't sort of over receiving a message of risk from local authorities. Kat or Nikki, did I miss anything on that topic?
I think that last point is not a criticism. Folks didn't know yet at the time when that the 2022 modeling was being done. So they were very much still operating on the 2019 modeling piece. But even with that 2019 modeling piece, this last bullet holds true, that there is a disconnect between who thinks they're at risk and who isn't. So I think this kind of paves the way for a lot of opportunity communicating that new modeling that just came out.
Great. Yeah. Thank you, Kat. Our next area for discussion and takeaway messaging is really focused on the findings that we have around forest management. And so what's really notable is that the Flagstaff area may be not representative of all communities throughout the West, but in terms of communities that are like Flagstaff, there are what we are finding in this particular community is that there are very high levels of understanding and support for forest management. We found that people understand the role of fire and that they understand what is needed to be done in order to reduce the risk of catastrophic wildfire and protect watershed health. There were positive responses for a diversity of different management strategies in the Flagstaff area, from thinning to fuel breaks, to fire use. There was high support for prescribed and managed wildfire, though it is notable there's less degree of support for the use of fire, but the support is still there and is still relatively high. And there is some slight variation. We didn't really get into these findings depending on a particular respondent's experiences with fire. So that can vary depending on where they are located, how they might have been impacted by that fire. But overall, take-home message, high level of support and understanding for forest management. It's also notable that there's continued support for future initiatives, like similar to the Flagstaff Watershed Protection Project, for implementing forest management. So there's high level of understanding for the need for collaborating across government entities and what that can do to address these cross-boundary issues like wildfire and post-wildfire flooding. So I think it's really notable, even knowing the cause of the museum fire and the unfortunate circumstances around that the public understands fire in Flagstaff, and it's reached a new threshold of understanding that these events, and the fact that our survey was out during the pipeline fire, which was quite notable, shortly following the tunnel fire, which was one of the first events in the Flagstaff area to result in the loss of structures. These things don't seem to be shaking the community away from understanding fire and forest management like we might expect it to. So I really want to emphasize that point. Kat or Nikki, anything else on that slide?
Nothing from me.
Okay. And our last takeaway is really focused on some of our reflections on this process. So this is a little bit of a methodological reflection. But we have, having been doing this research since 2019, looking at the museum fire, in addition to other research that we didn't talk about today, focused on the Schultz fire and other work that Kat has been doing in communities around Flagstaff in the West. But looking specifically to the museum fires, that it's really difficult to measure the effect of these events, especially when there are cascading disturbances like fire followed by post-fire flooding, with adjacent disturbances like heavy monsoon rains in the neighborhood just over from the burn scar flooding, while a survey is out during another fire and post-fire flooding. These things are all piling up on top of each other and really compound both the data collection in terms of the social experience and perceptions around that, as well as the ecological modeling. Where is the water coming from? What is the effect of the fire versus the fire in 2019 versus the potential effect of thinning versus the potential effect of a fire from 1970s, which was brought up as an issue during the museum fire flooding. So all of these things pile up and just call for a greater understanding of how these compounding emergencies that are tied to fire events are impacting people. One thing we didn't really go into a lot of detail on is that as part of this work, we've worked really closely with our partners in the city, county, Forest Service, and others to conduct this research. They provided input into the development of the survey and the sample frame, as well as worked with us on preliminary analysis. And one thing that we're finding in that deep engagement with our partners, our decision-making bodies, over years of working on this, is that there seems to be a sort of a duality here between the idea that there's a need for public support versus the idea that agencies need to communicate better. And so what I mean by that is that there's often a sentiment, I think, within our public agencies that there might not be public support. However, what we're finding is that, especially in this Flagstaff example, there is relatively high public support for forest management and understanding of the nuances of these things. I think what we're finding is that the public does support, they do understand, and there needs to be a two-way exchange of information from agencies, decision makers to the public, so that the public can really understand the nuances around the decisions, the rationale for decisions, and what that all means to them. So this multi-year process has really revealed to us that there is kind of a misconception that public support is low. We see that that is not the case, especially in Flagstaff. Now, we cannot say that that is the case everywhere, but in this particular area, we do find that. And also that this local research demonstrates a need for better understanding or a greater depth in public communication. So really figuring out how to message correctly, who to message to, and at what particular time. So refining communication is one of the big next steps. Anything else on that, Kat or Nikki, before I move on? I know we're getting close on time.
I'll just really quickly add on that last point. The public in the Flagstaff area are really curious about scientific decision-making processes. I think that rise in best available science has raised a lot of questions about, they're supportive of a fuel treatment, but they want to know how that prescription was developed, or that's the kind of level of detail that people are starting to look for now in order to decide whether they want to support something.
Great, thanks, Kat. Yeah, so that concludes our presentation here today. If you're interested in some of these additional resources, these are from the 2019 study. We have a white paper, which is written more for a decision-making audience, a fact sheet that summarizes that, and then a publication. I think Rachel put links to that in the chat as well. And we are in the process of developing a similar suite of products following the 2022 survey. So you can stay tuned for another white paper, fact sheet, and publication in the coming months. So with that, I want to thank everyone for your time, and I think turn it over to you, Rachel, for questions.
Great, thank you so much. So we have just about 6 minutes for questions. We can go a little later if folks are able to stay, because I know I have a bunch of burning questions and other people do as well. We'll start out with a question from Kate. wondering if you have any thoughts about why trustworthiness of information sources dropped.
I could start us off on this one. I have quite a few theories, but can't prove any of them. One overarching one would be people get a lot of information about fire. In this area, they don't get a lot of information about post-fire flooding. So I think that lack of familiarity as a starting point makes it harder to determine what is trustworthy and what isn't. Then it's very obvious when a fire is happening versus when it isn't. It's much harder to tell whether a flood risk forecast is true or not when it comes ahead of an event. So there's that ambiguity with the severity of a flood event that I think then leads people back to maybe these false warnings, or they're perceived as false warning. Hey, there's a potential for X number of inches of water, and then it only ends up being half an inch. That forecasting ambiguity, I think, can drive a lot of that. And then I think looking to the history in this area, there have been some tensions with certain pockets of the public about the Schultz fire burn scar area and treatment work or flood mitigation work there. I think that window that Melanie mentioned, where we didn't have flooding for 2 years after that fire, put people into kind of a sense of false security, and then to have it happen and hang on, we haven't mitigated for this. That was a bit of a reality check in some pockets of the neighborhoods as well. So those are my off the top of my head theories, but I don't know if Melanie or Nikki have anything to add.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is not something we can say directly from the data, but I think it's possible that people are just less clear on who to turn to for flooding information when it's very clear, just more clear who they can turn to for fire information. So it is really interesting to see how interconnected yet different these two types of events are.
Yeah, I was thinking, I appreciate those answers. I was thinking about catastrophe fatigue as well and how much that could play into this. I am curious, just as a follow-up, do you know how, if at all, fire managers, public information officers, and others in those official communication roles have responded to your findings that members of the public were looking for more regular updates, like every 2 hours?
I think there's a question of feasibility in that. I think particularly INSEWeb gets called out a lot for how come it's only being updated once a day or twice a day by some members of the public. They don't necessarily understand the complexity of needing a flight over the area and having to wait for wind conditions and things like that. So I think some of that conversation should maybe be oriented more towards expectation setting about the availability of information instead of trying to push out information without it being necessarily accurate. I think on the post-fire flooding side, there are a lot of great lessons learned from the Schultz fire that were applied here. So it does seem like people were pretty happy with how it went, but I don't know if we included this in the survey. There was a conversation we had with some local professionals about, do people really know when someone knocks on their door if they're from the city or the county, or they just know their government and they don't differentiate? And then that's bleeding into some of these challenges around how often communication is coming through as well. Anything else to add?
I would just add that we will be working, once we have our results ready to share, more like in a fact sheet and a white paper, that we will be sharing those directly with our local authorities in the Flagstaff area. And we have seen that following our 2019 survey, I think that we didn't measure that per se, but that we anecdotally, I think, provide some good food for thought for decision makers.
Great, thank you for that answer. So in the couple of minutes that we have left, both Jan Willem and Martha had some questions about modeling. To kick it off, Jan was wondering what kinds of modeling were performed and whether it focused on the flood area or if it also included areas of origin and values at risk.
I can start. So I'm just going to have to deflect this question and say we didn't do the modeling. We used the modeling results from an entity, a consulting company in town called J.E. Fuller. And so I would be remiss to attempt to answer some of these technical modeling questions. But suffice it to say, for the 2022 modeling area, what we do know is that it is much more refined than it was for the 2019 modeling area. As Kat mentioned, you can see the granularity in terms of the way that the floodwater is moving. And there are also multiple different types of scenarios that in addition to the one that we decided to use for our purposes and to understand where respondents were located with respect to flood risk. They also have modeled other types of scenarios or storm intensities, so velocity and whatnot. And so there's a wide variety of options that they are producing for modeling this. And I know that they are in the process of communicating those results and those findings out to the residents that are at risk. And so we are kind of in this period where, and that 2022 modeling did take into account mitigation work that had been done on the mountain. So yeah, that's sort of a non-technical answer for you. I hope that provides at least a little bit of information for the questions though.
Yeah, and if you could repeat one more time who did the modeling so folks might be able to refer back to that.
Yes, it's a company called J.E. Fuller.
Okay, great, thank you. This, you might have to deflect this one again as well, but a follow-up question was, has modeling led to any design solutions for how to make room for water in the future?
Yes, I do believe so. This would be a great question just to make sure it's answered correctly for our local officials, because they're the ones that are using those modeling results to inform natural channel design. And I know that the county, Coconino County and City of Flagstaff work directly with the modeling company, J.E. Fuller. And so I would imagine that those modeling outputs are being integrated into their decision making.
Yeah, I just would add that there's been a lot of recent work in the past year. I've only lived here in Flagstaff for the past 9 months, and I've just seen lots of work being done on the forest and slopes on creating retention basins and dealing with debris and creating wider channels to slow down floodwaters, and lots of work in partnerships with different funding sources from the county and the national forest and the city involvement. So there seems to be a lot of trying to mitigate this problem for sure.
And I can't remember, I think we had a question in this survey in 2022 that we maybe didn't include, and we had it for the Schultz fire survey we did recently about whether the public felt like enough was being done in terms of mitigation response. And the general response was, yep, people felt pretty good about what was going on. I actually wonder whether J.E. Fuller would be a good crowd to invite for a webinar, and they could go in depth, because I know they've done it for some fires near Tucson as well. They've done a couple bits and pieces, so that could be a recommendation.
Well, I appreciate that. I know that we're actually over time, and I wish I could ask a million more questions. I know that, Flagstaff is it's nestled in the mountains, in the forest, it's in a WUI area, so maybe a unique case study, but I really appreciate you all taking the time, coming on here today, giving your excellent presentation, and I look forward to the next time that we can have you on. So thank you so much, and thanks everyone for joining.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.